pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Wole Soyinka, who is going to deliver our lecture this afternoon. It is my pleasure to back Wole Soyinka. He doesn't really need an introduction, but I'll do. For those of you who are going to listen to him for the first time, let me do this introduction. He's with us this year as a non-resident fellow, following 2 years at the Du Bois Institute as a first Alphonse Fletcher Fellow. Soyinka is also currently Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife in Nigeria, where he used to be Professor of Drama. And Elias Ganem, Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he has also been Director of Literary Arts at the International Institute of Modern Letters. Wole Soyinka is Africa's most acclaimed writer. I don't think there's any possibility of dispute about that. In 1986, he became the first African to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. His writing is as much about the human condition under human pressure as it is about the political turmoil in his native Nigeria, of which, of course, we've heard a lot in the past couple of days, in fact, in the past week. Although he's primarily considered a playwright, Soyinka's poetry and novels are equally powerful, with a tone that ranges from satiric comedy to serious philosophy. The New York Times Book Review called Soyinka's first autobiographical work, Ake, a classic of African autobiography, indeed a classic of childhood memoirs, wherever and whenever produced. About the 1997, The Open Sore of a Continent, a personal narrative of the Nigerian crisis, which explores the future of the African nation state, the Christian Science Monitor wrote, "The trio of essays is passionate, stirring, and chock full of humor and insight." Martin Esslin has called Soyinka more generally one of the finest poetic playwrights who has ever written in English. Or, as the Irish Times simply puts it, he is a writer of genius. Soyinka's 1975 play, The Death and the King's Horseman, remains his most widely read, performed, and taught work. In fact, we've been teaching it in the past week or so at Harvard University. You'll be glad to know this. And it is rightly hailed as a classic. Among his other notable publications, there are so many. We have A Play of Giants, the novel Interpreters, and the autobiographical works Ake, The Years of Childhood, and The Man Died, Prison Notes, published in 1972, an account of his 22 months as a political prisoner in the late 1960s. More recently, he has published Climate of Fear, The Quest for Dignity in a Dehumanized World, which were the Reith Lectures during the year 2004. And finally, You Must Set Forth at Dawn, a memoir which was published in April of this year. A Yoruba, Soyinka was born in 1934 in Abeokuta, near Ibadan, in western Nigeria. His father was headmaster of the Anglican Mission School in the village of Ake, and it was here that Soyinka received his earliest education, which juxtaposed Christian training with schooling in traditional Yoruba beliefs and practices. He went on to study at the Government College in Ibadan, and then at the University of Leeds, from which he earned a doctorate in 1973. Actually, he actually studied for 2 years at the University of Ibadan, University College Ibadan, as it was then. He has taught drama and literature at universities in Ibadan, Lagos, and Ife, and he has held a number of fellowships and professorships in Europe and the United States at institutions including Cambridge and Sheffield Universities, Yale, Cornell, Harvard, and Emory. In 1999, Soyinka was named the first distinguished scholar in residence by New York University's African Studies Program and the Institute of African American Affairs. Soyinka's scholarly, civic, and arts honors are legion. He has received honorary doctorates from the University of Leeds, Yale, Harvard, and Emory, Morehouse College, and several others in Canada, France, Germany, South Africa, Cuba, and Hungary. I know, in fact, that he has turned down quite a number of awards, including the Ohio State University. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature of the United Kingdom, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Académie Universelle de Culture in France, the Academy of Arts and Letters, Germany, the Pan-African Writers Association. He's a member of the Scholars Council, U.S. Library of Congress, and a member of the Governing Council of the Bibliotheca Alexandria in Egypt. He is past president of the International Parliament of Writers. For his political work, Soyinka has received numerous honors, including the Akogun of Ishara and the Akilatun of Egba, Nigeria, Commander of the Legion of Honor, France, Commander of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic, the Felix Varela Award in Cuba, and honorary citizenship of Houston and New Orleans, among other cities. For his tremendous contribution to the arts of Africa, the United States, and indeed the world, he has been recognized with the Enrico Mattei Award for the Humanities, the Leopold Sedar Senghor Award for the Arts, the John Whitton Literary Prize, the Benson Medal of the Royal Society for Literature, the Premio Grinzane Cavour, the Premio Letterario Internazionale Mondello in Italy, the UNESCO Medal for the Arts, and of course, the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. Today, Soyinka delivers a new talk called Darfur, Anything to Do with Slavery, sponsored by the Du Bois Institute, the University Committee on Human Rights Studies, and the Committee on African Studies. Please share my great honor in welcoming Professor Soyinka.
Thank you.
Incidentally,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I've been asked to say that during the question and answer session, anybody who wants to make a comment or ask a question should go through the microphone up there. It's a long way to, and there are two actually. So maybe that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Biola. My ears couldn't help catching something during the introduction. Hardly ever listen to introductions, but I hadn't listened to Biola's for some time. So I was waiting to hear what new mischief he might might get up to. But as it turned out, it was not a mischief. It's just a repeat of a certain error, which I always take every opportunity to correct. I did not obtain a doctorate from Leeds University. I'm a doctoral dropout. And what happened was I did begin that exercise and decided I had more important things to do. And so I was summoned back. As we say in Nigeria, what will not get, then dasham. So I got an honorary doctorate from Leeds University. That part of it is accurate. There's a slight correction. So Darfur, anything to do with slavery. I'm most partial to rituals. But there is one ritual I would rather the world had never known. It ranks in my mind as one of the bleakest, most mentally eviscerating rituals that I've ever encountered in decades of exploring the world of dramatic rituals. That ritual used to take place on the coast of an ancient city called Ouida in present-day Republic of Benin, and its centerpiece was a tree named for its very function, the tree of forgetfulness, sometimes called the tree of forgetting. That function was this. When slaves were brought from inland towns and settlements of West Africa, usually victims of wars and slave raids engendered for that very purpose, they were placed in stockades on the coast, forts, and castle dungeons. The West African coastline is dotted with these mementos. Then, before embarkation, they were subjected to ritual processes which included moving in circles around this tree of forgetfulness. The ritual purpose was, of course, to make them forget their land, their homes, their kinfolk, and even the very occupation that they once knew, which sustained them. In short, their former existence, to wipe their minds clean of the past and make them receptive to new lives in strange places. Never was optimism more misplaced. As a ritual, it was a complete failure. Those slaves never forgot, and my mind often attempts to lock onto the mechanisms of those long-vanished minds that were of the victim, same earth, same history, same nurturing, the African slave hunters and middlemen. They thought up that ritual, not the alien invaders. One's habit of evocation takes the mind to those surreal moments of a shackled, circling humanity, wondering how many such trees exist, even symbolically, all over the landscape of other peoples, other races, and nations. The tree of forgetfulness survives in all its blooded glory, since next to it was also a telltale mound. That mound is a tumulus, the resting place of those slaves who could not wait to demonstrate that the ritual of forgetfulness lacked potency. They rebelled, refused to step on the gangways of those ships, or attempted to escape or foment uprisings, and were slaughtered on the spot. But even those who embarked and were shipped across to another world did not forget. And that world, or parts of that world anyway, have never been permitted or permitted themselves to forget. That is why for most of this year, not just in Britain, but in several parts of the world, the Caribbean especially, and in the Commonwealth member states of the African continent, events are taking place for the commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in Great Britain and its former possessions. Most Africans would prefer to forget the tree of forgetfulness, just as their descendants in this part of the world would also choose to forget, at least judging from the emotive reactions rising to virulent denunciations from a number of our colleagues here and in Africa to a television series that did no more than state truthfully that the tree of forgetfulness has its roots on the African soil by African hands, and that the processes, ritualistic or commercial, that desecrated so much of Africa's humanity implicated, ironically and embarrassingly, the very race that produced millions of such victims. Don't we all love to eat of the exonerating fruit of the tree of forgetfulness? We on the continent are not alone, though that is no consolation. It is a consequence of eating of that fruit, no matter by whom, that we are confronted with today. In other contexts, I have proposed that we may have to look to that primordial sin, the eating of that forbidden fruit, to account for the proliferation of new slave plantations on the African continent, presided over by succeeding generations of Simon Legris in black skin, even into contemporary times. I confess that certain primitive minds, such as this speaker's, find it difficult to comprehend the nature of any mind which, conscious of its own antecedents as victims of a history of enslavement, would choose to enslave others. Yes, that's the announcement that should have been made before we ever started. So here goes. Number one. How does it? Oh, yes. There's a new one. Sorry. Just shut that off. Excuse me a moment. I have to always remember where it goes off. Oh, yes. I remember now. I go all the way to the end, and that's it. Turn off. Mm-hmm. Oh, I have another one. Before it interrupts, you know, this one is for those who don't want to call me on the Nigerian phone. They say it's too expensive, so I had to get this one just to satisfy My mean friends here can't call me Nigerian. Okay, both are off me. Where was I? Excuse me, forgive me. Well, perhaps such people have forgotten, or they believe that history itself is a captive that should by now have made its final circle around the tree of forgetfulness. Well, others have not. Neither races nor national or global institutions. And the reasons for this are multiple. For a start, even the bleakest histories yield moments of elevation, and humanity is further impoverished when it permits itself to jettison such passages of courage, resilience, and survival, even transformation of the minds of the violators and their efforts at restitution. Thus, for a number of years now, UNESCO has promoted the ritual of the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, celebrated annually. Understandably, that commemoration will take on a special character this year. Nevertheless, my view is that not even this year's notation, nor indeed any before, will match the historic gravity of another 200th that occurred just 3 years ago, in 2004. Does that year ring a bell? Well, the year 2004 happens to have enjoyed the additional recognition of the independence date of the Republic of Haiti, the first black republic of the modern world, founded and governed by descendants of slaves, and thus the symbol of revolt against human enslavement throughout the New World, and a beacon for the spirit of freedom anywhere. Those of us who are or were once students of history, or have remained simply interested in the fortunes of their forebears throughout the world, including Pan-Africanists of all colors and shades, will recall the attempt of Napoleon to reimpose slavery on that colony in 1804, and his defeat at the hands of a slave army of African descendants under the leadership of Jacques Dessalines. Now, permit me to digress just a little on that very imperial name, Napoleon, a name that has become a metaphor for much ambiguous usage in modern times. History, we shall pause to note, conditions human thought in many ways. I was familiar with the expression the Napoleon of industry, or the Napoleon of commerce, commonly applied to the world business moguls, but I'd always imagined that it was a mere figure of speech. At no time did I ever suspect that it was a crown that remained on offer for whoever became the first tycoon to succeed in emulating Napoleon's venture in this 21st century, and thus re-establish the Caribbean as the center of the most enduring business enterprise that the world has ever known, the commerce in human flesh. We're not about to go into the history of the Napoleonic business venture, however, only to refer to its very recent purported revival, indeed a bare 4 months ago, as a pretext for an updated look at the essential phenomenon of slavery in any situation that cannot help but address issues that are so deeply intertwined with our seizure of the human condition and its fluctuating fortunes, especially that portion of it that so intimately concerns us on the African continent, freedom and human dignity. It is salutary to take a look at contemporary ramifications of that passage of human history, slavery, about which, needless to say, the last word has yet to be written. I'm not about to add a few more pages to that compendium, however. The phenomenon of slavery, with its multiple garbs, provokes considerations of how much of it may be attributable, even today, to the mental conditioning that is discernible in conduct that does strike some of us again and again as incompatible with the 21st century. That is, over half a century after the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, and 2 centuries after the original Declaration of the Rights of Man that launched the first political revolution in a contemporary world. If we adopt as our milestone the notation of the Age of Reason in the latter half of the 18th century, also known as the Age of Enlightenment. Do the following snippets read as if they have been accepted from a revised Brave New World of an Aldous Huxley or a capitalist version of George Orwell's 1984? Well, here goes, straight from internet. I quote. At a Wharton Business School conference on business in Africa in Philadelphia, USA, World Trade Organization representative Hanniford Schmidt announced the creation of a new initiative for full private stewardry of labor for the parts of Africa that have been hardest hit by the 500 years of Africa's free trade with the West. End of quote. Now, what exactly did Mr. Hanniford Schmidt mean by full private stewardry of labor? Here are the relevant quotes. The stewardship will require modern companies doing business in some parts of Africa to own their workers outright. Again, the program will require such business to privatize humans themselves. Again, full untrammeled private stewardry is the best available solution to Africa's poverty and the inevitable result of the free market theory. Again, Schmidt admitted that in many ways, private stewardry was similar to slavery, but just as compassionate conservatism has polished the rough edges on labor relations in industrialized countries, full stewardship or compassionate slavery could be a similar boon to developing countries. End of quotes. I believe that this is more than a fair sampling of the detailed scheme in the presentation by a representative of World Trade Organization to the Wharton Business Conference of Philadelphia. No, just once more. It's very difficult to resist Mr. Hanniford's concluding remarks, which go thus. That is what free trade is all about, the freedom to buy and sell anything, including people. End of quote. Let us now move away from Philadelphia, Haiti, and the diaspora to the original homeland of those slaves on the African continent, or slaves to be, and pay some attention to their fate, remaining more or less in contemporary time. Oh, did I remember to reveal that the Wharton Business Conference in Philadelphia was all an elaborate jape, perpetrated by two high-spirited individuals? Oh yes, it was meant as a critique of GATT and the international production and trading conditions that give the West its exploitative economic domination over the developing world. The authors of that fictitious conference, perhaps inspired by Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, were taking on the continuing operations of sweatshops and slave labor in the developing world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America especially, but let this be carefully noted. Just as was the case of Swift's satire 2 centuries ago, such was the level of truth beneath the hyperboles that the pranksters did succeed in being taken seriously in several instances. They received invitations to other trade conferences, the genuine article this time, and engaged in serious exchanges over a website that they'd set up specifically for that purpose. This hilarious critique of globalization. It would be wise indeed for us to take the episode seriously. Indeed, to read it as a hyped-up version of the reality of today's production relations called globalization. Parody, we must never permit ourselves to forget, is a window on truth, however preposterous its propositions. Parody proceeds from fact, from truth and reality. But that's not me. Who is it this time? Oh, I turned you off. honestly. Excuse me. I'm sure I did. Skip, why don't you just skip this for me? Uh, yeah, you know how to do this? Yeah, it's new. Take this as well. Yeah, it's Skip who made me get it. He's been singing its praises for ages. Yeah, where were we? Right, I was going to ask, why was this jape so successful? Well, how is it possible for it to have succeeded so riotously, especially to that people actually lined up to sign them up? Surely that question contains its very answer. Given the chance, the targeted audience would welcome such a reversion to a desired status. The episode went beyond applauding a solution to a troublesome economic issue. The will to reverse the hands of the clock was in operation. The exposure of a psyche that had never really come to terms with the doctrine of equality or the catechism of the fundamental human rights of other beings. Why, to cite yet another moment of revelation, why should anyone have been astonished at the public outburst of that sitcom star? I couldn't remember his name when I was writing this. A revelation that shattered the complacency of the American Tele-Society. He was the one who went utter all sorts of racist obscenities right on camera. Yes, whatever his name is. You know him, one of these sitcom people. You remember it? Yeah, I can't remember. No, tall, thin fellow with the bobbing Adam's apple. Okay, that's the one. Yeah. Okay.
And Jesse Jackson got rich in Al Sharpton because of that.
I know. You know, I wish I lived in this country. You know. So you see, the horror of that event did not lie in the torrent of racial obscenities that poured out of the mouth of a man whose job is to make people laugh and relax. No, it was what it implied, that he was obviously not alone, and that it was only the extent to which his racist theology might take him that separated him from perhaps others who, like those three men, for instance, who only 2 or 3 years ago picked up a black man at random, tied him to the back of a truck, and literally flayed him alive on the streets of their city. Does anyone truly imagine that it's only within these borders? And we're coming now to the question. Does one imagine that it's only within these borders of a once openly slave society that we encounter such a pathology, nurtured by the identical nature of the history that has produced America's own subsisting pathology? We're speaking, of course, of the history of slavery. But enough of that digression, one that is not quite a digression, since it is meant to thrust us into a painful reality of human relationships. Let us resume our journey of the factual, homing on a specific yet ongoing scenario that yet again instructs, or perhaps I should say more accurately, accuses much of humanity of its tragic limitations in the effort to escape the conditioning of such history, most of all when it comes to a determination of the rights and the dignity of others. The picture is not altogether bleak, admittedly. Some do ultimately escape this conditioning, fly off its seemingly magnetized trajectory into a rational orbit of recognition and respect for the humanity of others. This process may occur as a result of some form of enlightenment that comes through internal discourse, through exposure to possible alternative models of such relationships. It could also emerge as a consequence of natural or external disasters, a drastic reversal of that undermines assumptions based on presumptive self-regarding, revealing to the upholders and purveyors of the doctrine of human superiority their own vulnerability or imperfection, so that for the first time they come to see themselves as they have viewed others. In many cases, alas, such a moment of enlightenment, or at least some form of accommodation with alternative views of the other humanity, arrives through violent confrontations, as in the case of Haiti, a reaction from within or as an equally forceful intervention by others. I shall not attempt to predict what form of resolution will result on the African continent from the most dangerous manifestation of this chronic pathology, the condescending relationship between one racial entity and another that the world chooses to ignore or casually address as a distant aberration, but am moving too far ahead of my ultimate destination. So let me backtrack a little. Slavery or human bondage, that relationship known as master-slave, in its myriad forms of subtlety and crudity, let me remind you, is our underlying theme. The phenomenon of human subjugation that appears to endure through the ages and across cultures, and is related to that much understated, largely unexplored axis of socio-political coexistence, whose polar ends are accurately designated as power and freedom. Traveling through the United States these days, especially in some southern parts, it becomes difficult to recall that as recently as 40 years ago, maybe even later, it was a tradition in that part of the world that today claims leadership of the democratic world, not only to tar and feather, castrate, and then publicly hang the black man, but to do so in an atmosphere of revelry, as families held picnics at the venue of the event, complete with barbecues and strolling minstrels. Picture postcards were printed of that event, sent to friends and relations who could not participate in the revelry, with the commiserating greeting, "Wish you were here." There was quite recently a traveling exhibition of such postcards and posters. I saw it in Atlanta, and I believe that a coffee table publication has been made from it. Not my idea of a companion read to my relaxed morning espresso, but it hopefully serves to wean its local readership away from sheltering under the tree of forgetfulness, mar them in the shame of their past, and perhaps compel them to examine present conduct for vestiges of such a past of barbarism, a past that may thereby have conditioned them in imperceptible negative ways, operating subconsciously on their interaction with people of contemned races. Those scenes of lynch revelry seem such a distant tradition today. However, totally incomprehensible to many descendants of those perpetrators, but it was a tradition of the time. Undoubtedly, some diehards in these same nations still look back with nostalgia to those days, wondering what is this aberration called progress that came to deprive them of their favorite Sunday outing. These are the breeds that fell so easily to that preposterous gambit of the fictitious Hanniford Schmidt. How else explain the incident to which I earlier referred, the notorious thrill killing of a black man, a total stranger to the killers, selected at random, or the savage beating of a Rodney King, or the butchery of the Senegalese migrant into whose body over 50 bullets were pumped by the police right on his own doorstep under the glare of a security lamp over the doorway. Or yet another West African who, after his savage beating, was sodomized in a police station with a broomstick. And so, from these domestic scenarios leaps the question, are there other places on this globe in which the vestiges of a similar history play a hidden role in the formation of attitudes, nations where such incidents are not abnormalities that provoke the intervention of the law, however imperfectly applied, but constitute the norm, a constant, recurrent not only as individual abnormalities, but as a policy of state. Now, no one will question that in the cases I've just cited, there was the obvious difference between the lynch gangs and their victims' race. However, there was an equally important, though often understated one, that had conditioned the mental state of disdain and impunity in the relation of one to the other. After all, as some of us distinctly remember too well, even as late as the 1960s and 70s, when racial discrimination, even in cities like New York, was like a wet towel that hit one in the face, there was applied a distinct pecking order among peoples of African descent. Proprietors of hotels, gas stations, restaurants, and other public institutions actually sought to distinguish between African visitors from the continent and their black nationals of the United States. Once I had the great privilege, it was bestowed like an honor, of receiving an apology from a white proprietor cum waiter. It was in the 70s, and who became quite contrite about his earlier racist attitude. I'd been seated at my table at least 20 minutes, and he'd walked past me at least a dozen times to serve others, staring straight ahead. Finally, putting on my best British accent, because I knew what was up, I stopped him and I was looking at my dear man, am I getting any service here or not? He stopped, looked at me and said, excuse me? I said, am I getting any service? I've been sitting here at least 30 minutes and you keep walking past me. Am I getting served? Of course, the next question is, where are you from? Nigeria. I informed him, West Africa. Do you know where that is? A grudging, twisted grin of embarrassment came over his face and he said, oh, I'm sorry, but you should have told me you was from Africa. Operating in the head of that man, in addition, of course, to his instinctive rejection of a black figure, was a history, a property relationship that was formed by that history and remained immutable, owner and owned. Unarticulated, it filled out the social matrix of his relationship with the other, an other who additionally was distinguished and identifiable by his pigmentation, hair, nose, and lips. To cure that individual of his historic conditioning requires more than the compulsion of the law. But true, he could no longer reach for his whip and thrash the uppity nigger, or grab his shotgun and blast him back to Africa. However, for the full transformation of his inner psyche, he would have to undergo the rites of confrontation, an end to the denial of a specific iniquity of history, and a repudiation of the meretricious social privileges that such a history conferred on him. I do not recall that history for the fun of it, but to evoke certain actualities that can be summed up as a degradation of the human personality, which is the essence of the master-slave relationship, one that is experienced in insecurity and uncertainty on the one hand, and arbitrariness and impunity on the other. It does not matter whether or not this relationship is played out in lush cocktail lounges of American genteel society or by some sand-clogged waterholes and scrubland of the African Sahelian region. Both speak of a certain history, a common one, whose holdovers continue to dominate the realities of daily existence, varying only in the lethal degree of consequences for any challenges to that relationship and the comprehensiveness of the developed culture of impunity. Similarities, yes, but also differences, such as, for instance, is the continuum of that originating history of that relationship one of denial? Or is it one of recognition, acknowledgement, however grudging, and possibly shame, remorse, and repudiation, perhaps even some form of restitution? Even minus the remorse or repudiation, at least a consciousness of that history, a sense of, at the very least, an unfortunate passage that must be taken into reckoning as a factor in the creation of a new understanding. In short, the pressure of memory as a restraining or ameliorating agent. The point here is that it is not only this continent or Europe that requires a traveling exhibition of the equivalent of the lynch days of a slaving culture. There are more than sufficient monographs and sketches of slave caravans strung along landscapes that bear not the remotest resemblance to the Haitian or Mississippi tropics. Sea vessels that belong to a different seafaring culture of windjammers, frigates, caravels, and schooners, and the oceans and seas that they traverse are separate from the Atlantic Ocean. The museums of Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and even some on the West African coast boast records of a different slaving trajectory that preceded the transatlantic and even outlasted it, in some cases subsisting till this very day. Not that all this is forgotten, no. It is that it is censored, consciously suppressed. Nowhere in those parts of the slaving world shall we encounter a traveling exhibition of that past to explain, or at least suggest to descendants from that history, the genesis of the relationship between some warring parts of the same continental space. Not in all aspects, but definitely in some. Not always, but very often, the past clarifies the present. And again, not always, but always potentially, a confrontation with or interrogation of that part assists us in redressing the present and redirecting the future. Permit me to quote parts of a memorandum that I very recently prepared for just such an interrogation. I wrote, quite apart from the ethical principles that sustain scholarship, such as respect for knowledge in its own right, there is the equally important moral value of learning to confront one's past, a value that is applicable to individuals as to social entities, be these categorized as race, nation, religious sects, social or occupational classes. It is this value that spurred the Vatican to pronounce, under the last Pope, its remorse for grievous errors of its past, especially its crusade of aggression against the people of Islamic faith. Or the Spanish government, about a decade ago, to express its regrets over the anti-Semitic crime committed in the 15th century under an edict of Ferdinand and Isabella. In his 2006 address at the commemoration of the struggle against the slave trade, Mr. Kuchiro Matsuura, the Director General of UNESCO, underlined the mission of such commemorations and confrontations with the past in the following words: to contribute to the establishment of the spirit of tolerance and peaceful coexistence between races and peoples. And so we come to the question, if the Arab world had been brought into a full confrontation with its past of slaving relationship with the African, would Darfur have been possible? Would it have endured so long and with such savagery? Possibly not. But then again, perhaps such immersion in knowledge of one's past would have made no difference. We can attempt conclusions by references to parallel histories of unedifying race relationships across the globe: Nazi Germany, Armenia, Yugoslavia, the Middle East, and others. And we'll still find ourselves in the realm of speculations with no more, perhaps, than the tantalizing prospect of an optimistic vision. At the very least, however, and given such uncertainties, we can hardly deny ourselves the value that remains intrinsic to knowledge itself, one which, while it may or may not influence contemporary conduct, endures in its own autonomous realm. Its pursuit, as an exercise of intellect and attachment to truth, is an inalienable right of all peoples and should be immune from transitory considerations such as politics. End of quote. And then, guess what? Only this morning, I open up the New York Times and I'm confronted with a full-page advertisement on this very theme. After decades of denial, of ruptures of diplomatic relationships between nations, for taking one side or the other over a bitterly contested historical lacuna, the attempt to tamp down memory and bury its remains at the foot of the tree of forgetfulness, along comes the banner, "Let's unearth the truth about what happened in 1915 together." It announces that Turkey and Armenia will set up a joint commission of historians to study the facts that lie beneath accusations and denials over that passage of history. In the words of the foreign minister of Turkey, I quote, "We eagerly await a positive response from Armenia, agreeing to establish a joint commission and declaring its readiness to accept its conclusions. I hereby extend an invitation to any third country, including the United States, to contribute to this commission by appointing scholars who will certainly work to shed light on these tragic events and open ways for us to come together." the key words, open ways for us to come together, based on the moral authority of nothing less than the historic truth. As the Prime Minister of Turkey himself declares, we can face the truth about our past. We call upon the Armenians to do the same. The Director General had indeed embarked on the same advocacy in his institution's project on the slave route. Relationships between peoples, nations, and cultures should be built on objectivity, candor, and respect, the last of which is informed by a willingness to understand the other through its own truthful history, not through the lacunae inserted by others into such a history. An attempt to suppress parts of history, be it in Yugoslavia, Armenia, or the Sudan, may be due to the following. 1, a sense of shame or embarrassment. 2, a rejection or denial of that part of history, a kind of passive revisionism that stems from guilt. 3, a sense of the rightness, appropriateness, even justification of such a past. And finally, most relevantly, 4, a resolve to perpetuate that past in the present and future, be it as a set of values, relationships, politics, or indeed as inherent group ideology. Race upheavals of increasing virulence in Zanzibar, Mauritania, etc., in the past 3 decades, and most lately, on an unprecedented scale in the Sudan, bring this home to us in the most inglorious manner. Was Darfur enabled, even made thinkable, by any or all of that list of negative motivations? Certainly the last, a resolve to perpetuate the past, is a strong consideration for what has been uncovered in the very conception and implementation of state-instigated race terror. Few will deny that the events in the Sudan are based on a perception that dates back to a relationship rooted in the history of slavery, calling attention to cite Matsura's, once again, to the continent's own share in the, I quote, the particularity of this tragedy and its persisting consequences for modern societies. This is the practical lesson for the moral imperative that is deeply embedded in the mission statement of UNESCO as it embarked on the Slave Route Project. I quote, to break the silence surrounding the slave trade and slavery. It would seem that the American president, Bill Clinton, during his presidency, discerned also a need for some process of exorcism within the society over which he presided, thus his attempts to redress history. It struck me as a remarkable exercise at the time, remarkable in that there appeared to have been no immediate cause for it, no event that triggered off the recollection of that past and the need for a rethink of history. In addition to rehabilitating, you may remember, the Hanged Witches of Salem, a 400 years old history, and the subject of Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, Clinton apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment that used black people as guinea pigs without their knowledge of the actual cause of the experiments. That is, they were injected with the syphilis virus, but treatment was withheld from some of them. One of the most diabolical events in medical scientific research on this side of the equator. That disposable human material was, of course, none other than the progeny of slaves, in short, hereditary property. Bill Clinton followed his journey through historic remorse while on African soil by coming quite close to an apology for the slave trade. Was he playing politics? It hardly matters. The motivating factor for these revisions of history, one positive face of historic revisionism, goes beyond attempting to close the account books of the past. In fact, they're anything but closing the accounts. They reopen the obscured ledger sheets of reckoning, thus serving as a potential critique, perhaps a restraining factor for present and future human designs. Clinton's gesture of redressing history has also been matched in Asia. The Japanese were being dragged to the confessional altar, made to express some kind of remorse for their crimes against the Korean people. The sexual enslavement, again that word, that subhumanizing condition, the enslavement of Korean women, known as troops comfort women, or sacrificial brides to the Shinto gods. And finally, to bring us up to the present, that is no more than just a few months ago, at the approach of this bicentennial anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in British possessions, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, came as close, or nearly as close, as Bill Clinton to an apology to the African peoples for the role of the British in the trade in human flesh. We're very nearly at destination. 4 months ago, on November 11, 2006 to be exact, a rather quaint ritual took place in a hall on the third floor of the building directly opposite the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. Because of its location and the height of the floor, that ritual was played out against a background of United Nations flags fluttering across the street through the room-length window of the hall. It took the form of a judicial trial. And believe it or not, I was the unlikely presiding judge on that occasion. And the event was to try the leader of a nation accused of crimes against humanity. Yes, it was a form of play acting, but it was a deadly serious one, conducted in all solemnity. Witnesses had been flown into New York for that purpose. Aid workers, outside observers, journalists who had barely escaped becoming casualties themselves, but above all, the victims, direct victims and survivors, some of whom were still undergoing counseling for the trauma they had undergone. Some of them choked up. Others could not hold back tears as they testified, as memories of the fate of others flooded their minds, and they relived days and weeks of anguish all over again. Yes, unanimously and predictably, the panel of judges found the defendant, General Omar Bashir of Sudan, guilty as charged. It was a symbolic act designed to trigger awake the designated structural engineers of an ideal world order, the UN clan, who remain trapped, however, in the gilded web of rhetoric and protocols, bargaining and double talk, while the greatest crime against humanity on the African continent since the killing spree of Rwanda was taking place right under their watch. What they have for dessert in the UN restaurants and cafeteria is so easy to discern. It is fruits specially flown in from the Wida tree of forgetfulness. Those who wish to understand the undercurrents of the mind that breeds and nurture the inhuman conduct of the Sudanese government against sections of its own populace, notably the people of Western Sudan, the Darfur, would do well to take good note of the role of history in this scenario. It is totally superfluous that the favorite battle cry, as abundantly testified by survivors of the Janjaweed marauders in their mission of ethnic cleansing, has been none other than the historic cry of disdain, kill the slaves. The Ku Klux Klan, Night Riders of the American Deep South, had a similar cry, hang the niggers. That exhortation has been recorded in numerous testimonies, including at the New York Tribunal. Kill the slaves and variants thereof. That yet unexpiated history of the trans-Saharan and trans-Indian Ocean slave trade, that is, the centuries-old history of the relationship between two races on the African continent, has coalesced into a master-slave tradition, one that establishes one part of the population as its subhuman sector, subject to permanent humiliation through neglect, double standards of governance, of the uneven application of the law, of the enthronement of impunity, leaving such a sector prone to elimination if and whenever it insists on a revision of its social status. Those who find it difficult to make a transposition of their sensibilities to the landscape of Darfur should simply revert to their own not-so-distant history, vestiges of which still dominate their conduct towards the other and erupt from time to time, as in the case of the star of the TV sitcom. Like the Korean comfort women or the black victims of lynch sport and the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the people of Darfur remain object possessions in the mind of the ruling class of the Sudan, who pride themselves as Arabs and suzerains, often indistinguishable in complexion, Bound together by the same religion, the violators nonetheless cognize themselves as beings of a slave-owning pedigree, a distinction that takes its authority from none other than the consistently obscured, evaded, or deodorized history of pre-European, that is, Arab slavery on the African continent. That yet subsisting pathology of the slave-master relation is memorably captured in an anecdote recounted by the Nigerian author, Collier Motosho, in his reprise of Nigerian history just before dawn. Motosho was writing about that phase in West African history when the movement for the abolition of the slave trade finally got underway, from whatever motivations, commercially convenient, altruistic, or a mixture of both, doesn't matter. A British colonial officer attempted to lecture an emir, as a traditional ruler in northern Nigeria, on the British resolve to end the slave trade. It riled that potentate beyond endurance, causing him to explode. "Can you tell a cat to stop mousing? I shall die with a slave in my mouth." End of quote. Like that emir, like the slave master of the American Deep South and West Indian plantations, who insisted on their right to do whatever they wanted with their property, brand, amputate, castrate, rape, or hang them. Like Napoleon, who traduced the Age of Enlightenment in order to re-enslave the nation of Haiti. Like the thrill killers of the USA, like those and thousands more unrecorded examples, the Sudanese government says to the United Nations, and indeed to its African peer governments, mind your own business. This is a sovereign state, one that must be left alone to exercise its prerogative of ownership over its human possessions. This is the only reality that has resulted in over 200,000 dead, victims as much of indiscriminate aerial bombardments as of state-supported marauding gangs, places 2.5 million humanity in makeshift tents, prey not only of the dry desert wind, of drought and disease, but of the marauding horse and camel riders of the Janjaweed, the Ku Klux Klan of Darfur, who ride out to pillage even the scanty rags of these dispossessed people, and even in refugee camps located beyond the Sudanese borders, confident not only of the protection, but of the propulsive complicity of the government. The escapade of those two pranksters on internet proved in the end no absurdity at all, but a peek into a world of contemporary reality. The Wharton Business School thrives in Khartoum, and except that on the curriculum the words compassionate slavery have been expunged, Mr. Hanniford Schmidt is alive and well in Darfur, with his mission of the re-enslavement of the African peoples on African soil. It is this reality that emboldens the Sudanese government to camouflage its military planes with the colors and emblem of the United Nations as it imports tons and tons of arms into the beleaguered area in violation of the Security Council's injunctions and its own agreements, and right under the noses of UN observers. That exercise continues even as we meet here and speak. It is that history that the government makes the government proclaim in black and white its mission to Arabize the entire Sudanese landscape, which of course necessitates the eradication of other indigenous cultures and the extermination of its peoples. I believe that the word, the avoidance word, that remains missing in UN resolutions is genocide. That Emir's tale, I assure you, is not apocryphal, and it mercifully speaks of a largely extinct species, transplanted through a time warp into the Sudan. The orders that the Sudanese government has given its stormtroopers for its final solution, the incontinent Janjaweed, as it arms them with the very latest weaponry and logistical support from special military detachments, are precisely the sentiments of the emir. Ride out and return with a few dozen slaves in your mouth. The Janjaweed have followed that exhortation and some. This is what the world, but most accusingly, our own African continent, yet fail to understand. That is why the conscience of the African continent The staging ground of the much vaunted African Renaissance has gone into a prolonged Harmattan sleep, slumped around the tree of forgetfulness. The very notion is mind-boggling, an insolent ordination of the mangy catechism of impunity, that while the rest of the world, the Japanese, the Europeans, the Americans, and possibly now the Turks, are redressing history, reinforcing the termination of a shameful past, expressing remorse for such a past in other parts of the world, the very opposite, an atavistic assertiveness is in the ascendancy on our black continent in the 21st century. A ruling, exultantly racist cabal elevates that same shaming history to a principle of racial pride and mobilizes its bandits to consolidate historic iniquities. In their hundreds of thousands, today's slave catchers are still overrunning ancient settlements, burning crops, slaughtering cattle, poisoning wells, raping mothers in front of their own children and husbands, girl pupils in front of their teachers, fathers and mothers, pulverizing villages and eradicating cultures, unrepentant riders of night and day defiant of world censure. They died off in total confidence of immunity, in full glare of the world's searchlights, with literally hundreds of slaves in their mouths. Never again was the oath that followed Auschwitz and Belsen. Never again read the United Nations ring in resolve after Yugoslavia and Rwanda. When it's all over in Darfur, we shall undoubtedly be lulled yet again into a state of amnesia by those two words of numbing predictability, landscaped into the accommodating earth of the African continent, draped around the sole surviving growth in the Darfurian wasteland, the tree of forgetfulness. A sturdy, ironic emblem that places the future in denial all over again with the world's unfulfilled promise, never again. Thank you very much.
My question regards the issue of sort of reviving, or rather finding out the truth about the past as a precondition to actually developing and going past it. And I understand the need for this, but I'm curious about the African context.
A need for the what? Sorry, speak up.
In the African context,
Yes.
where we've had lots of conflicts of ethnic nature, which of course could also lead to future that could lead to future insurrections of violence. Then what of the reconciliation process, if we were to go and expose the truth right now, would probably spur up a lot of emotions in places like DRC or Rwanda and would probably lead to further violence. So is there a need to wait before we can go ahead and do this investigation? And if there's waiting, for how long would it be?
Yeah, well, there's always a risk in resurrecting history. I mean, nobody should deny that. But when you look at the present and it's intolerable, it's unbearable, the negativities of the present escalate all the time, you must look backwards and see what could possibly be missing, among other things. And you redress what is in your capacity to redress. That confrontation with history is an obvious one. It's an obvious one, and it's taking place all over the world. Among the examples, I've cited some of the examples. So it's not a question of waiting. It's a process we should go on. UNESCO, in fact, is returning to the slave route project, this time more comprehensively than it did before. Because originally, there was this kind of censorship, this sensitivity, quote-unquote, political correctness, that kind of thing. I hate that expression and that attitude. It's so morally flaccid. But I think now people are beginning to understand that a thoroughgoing, if you're going to look at history at all, you must look at history in its comprehensive way. And most especially, if there could be explications of the present in that history. So you're right, it's not a question of waiting. It should be an ongoing process.
Oh, Your Majesty, I don't have the language to thank you. Now look, I'm going to get down on something here. That word veritas, it means truth. The man is speaking truth. By the way, just the way he is a way to break chains. You break chains. We must break the chains of illiteracy, the chains of pimpdom, the chains of disrespecting women, the chains of sloth. We've got to build our mind, or we're going to die. This man is a warrior. The fact that he's even here makes this thing exquisitely powerful. And I want to say to you, across the world right now, you are an icon, a king, a majesty, and there's a way to be in your very bearing. You'll say something. So I want to salute you and thank you for all of us because you have this majesty of your mind, your courage, your body, and guess what? You are what I would like to become someday if I keep working at it. So thank you very much.
Brother Blue.
Get to work.
Thank you, Brother Blue. Thank you. Thank you.
Next question.
Yes.
True, like you drank my heart. You made a home run, Blue. That's my man right there.
So I had a quick clarifying question. So you say Hannaford Schmidt is present in Darfur as we speak, for example. And so when you say that the riders of Darfur go out protected by their own history and the pathologies of their own history, are you also assigning blame for Darfur with the pathologies of our histories, for example, like why the United Nations takes so long to do things? Are you saying Hannaford Schmidt there as the WTO representative, as a economic imperative to let what happens in Darfur happen in Darfur, or is it more of a Turkey has its own historical pathologies, the U.S. has its own historical pathologies, Britain does, and that prevents them from taking active roles in what happens in Darfur, even as they confront their own histories?
Yeah, not so much protected when they ride out. They're not so much protected by, but motivated by. The attitude. It's an attitudinal thing. Who are we dealing with? They ask themselves, are they human beings? They say, no, they're slaves. That's what it boils down to. But no, they're slaves. They've always been slaves. That's why they use the expression, kill the slaves. It's there even in the documentation which has been taken from the headquarters of the Janjaweed, this Sheikh Musa Hilal, I beg your pardon, who is one of those under secret indictment by the United Nations, incidentally. The man who actually runs the Janjaweed and who holds a virtual position in the Sudanese government. So it is that history, that attitude, which motivates them. So they don't see the people they're killing as human beings. The people whose wells they're poisoning, whom they're raping, they don't see, they just see them as, sex objects to be degraded even further. So it's not so much protected by, but definitely motivated by. Now, the United Nations, it's a collection. It's a collection, and when you consider, for instance, that China, for a long time, was one of those who prevented rigorous action being taken by the United Nations. And why did China? Why did it always take this obstructionist position? Because it's doing business with the Sudanese government. Only recently, the foreign minister of China finally visited Darfur, visited Sudan and Darfur, and made a strong critical statement. Why did he do that? The Olympics on the way, and it knows that a number of countries are looking with disfavor at its conduct. So it's visited there, and it's trying to, pour a little bit of, rub a little Vaseline on the cancer. It doesn't amount to much. And many others in the United Nations, including African nations, are so guilty themselves. What is Mugabe running right now? But a slave plantation. And so they lack the moral authority. They have their own history and their own present, which is like a millstone around their necks and which just erodes any kind of moral and principled position that they want to take. And most of the time, anyway, it's bargaining. If you know anything of the United Nations, it's a question of, look, if you withdraw your objection to this little thing over there, well, you can kill a few more hundreds. I'll turn my back on it. It's bargaining. The ability to actually operate on principle in a unified form is a difficult one because they all come from so many backgrounds. But we on the outside should understand how things operate and go against it and put pressure wherever possible. Yes.
Next question.
Hannaford Schmidt, by the way, I hope I made quite clear, is a fictitious figure. I just use it as a metaphor. I don't want to be quoted as saying he's real.
Any more questions? If you have to go up to the microphone, you better pay the question. Yeah, do we have drinks and stuff
Okay. I'm wondering, in view of what you said, do you think that the United States and also certain groups in the United States and possibly Israel have a motive? I understand that this is an African problem, but are seeking to benefit by going into Darfur and actually aiding. Like I've heard that DynCorp is in, which is a private mercenary force that the United States has mercenaries in Iraq right now, and that Blackwater's thinking of going into Darfur. And with the oil and the uranium and the minerals in Darfur, what my concern about isn't that there has been a historic African problem. It is that the United States and Western colonial powers again want to benefit off of Africa. And I wish you would address
I hope
that.
I understood your question. Lance, the way I understood it.
Excuse
Sorry.
me, I'm a little bit concerned when Madeleine Albright and George Bush expressed sympathy at this point towards the people, because usually most of the time we see them exploiting people. So I have my doubts about
Well,
the
first of all,
motivation.
let me make it clear that this is not an appeal to the United Nations to go in, anything but that. But Sudan is a member of the United Nations family. When certain crimes are committed, the protocols of the United Nations authorize the United Nations to go in. And if armies under the aegis of either the African Union or even the European Union or the United Nations go into Darfur today, as long as the United Nations does not, as usual, try and suggest that it is they going to liberate that place and then complicating the situation even further, that solution is always acceptable. Nigerian soldiers, African soldiers are serving everywhere. They got killed in Yugoslavia. They got killed in Lebanon. They're peacekeepers in the Congo. Well, why should a beleaguered, a troubled nation, people not benefit also from an organization which exists to maintain certain basic humanistic norms on the globe? Why don't they have the right to call on organizations like that also for help? As has been done, incidentally, by some African nations. I can tell you that people like leaders like Kufuor, the president of Ghana, have been very strong on the issue of Sudan. They succeeded in preventing Bashir from becoming the next president of the African Union just recently, as a kind of token punishment. But it does not go far enough. The Janjaweed are out there being armed, backed by aerial bombardments, and so some kind of action is required beyond these symbolic gestures. That's all.
Yes, your answer to my question may actually have been implicit in your answer to the previous question, but given the paralysis of the United Nations, I wonder what you think about humanitarian grounds as being a permissible basis for individual nations sending military force to be of assistance in Darfur. The reason why the United States turned to NATO in Kosovo was because nobody else was giving them international law authorization for interfering. I confess I'm a mixed mind about this, but I'm wondering whether you have thoughts about whether individual nations that might be willing to assist should be allowed legally under international law to assist if the United Nations remains inactive.
Yeah. Once the United Nations, you see, the crime which the United States committed in Iraq is that it went into Iraq in violation of the position of the United Nations. That's the main fault of the United States. It had no moral authority for its action. Unlike, for instance, Afghanistan, which was as a consequence of a United Nations resolution. But once the United Nations passes, institutes sanctions against the government of Sudan and calls on its member nations to assist in enforcing those sanctions, either through blockades, in direct intervention, then it's got the authority. And African nations have a right to ask for assistance, bilateral assistance, on the basis of that authority. That's all that it takes. Yep.
Hi. I enjoyed your talk. Let me start with that. But I wanted to ask a question on how you mentioned earlier that maybe if Darfur had, or the Sudan had acknowledged their history of involvement in the slave trade and kind of dehumanizing Africans and the Arab slave trade as the pre-European slave trade, if that were acknowledged in Africa and by Arabs, then that might maybe have prevented the situation. And my question is, how could that possibly happen logistically, as the Arab empire that imposed, I guess, slavery is a collection of countries now, and how I mean actually in terms of carrying out that edict, how could it do that?
Yeah, when you say logistically, no, it's not logistically. There'll be no logistic connection between memory in this instance and actuality. We're talking about attitude. That's why I stress that word attitude. You destroy people if you think they're inferior beings. You treat them with contempt, with disdain. And we're asking, how did this disdain arise? And I'm saying it goes back into a history which the Arab section of that nation refuses to acknowledge, refuses to confront. The confrontation might lead to, as I listed, several attitudes. It can lead to a hardening of attitudes. In other words, could say, yes, this is a justification for continuing. This has always been the relationship, historic relationship. And therefore, we have a right to continue to repress and exterminate these people. On the other hand, I say that the possibility exists, because don't forget, there are also people within this so-called Arab section of the Sudan who are shamed by what is happening, some of whom have left, some of whom, in fact, have been tortured, one of whom actually came to give evidence at the tribunal because he was against the policy of his government. So you see, enlightenment also leads to some form of transformation of people, and therefore to a kind of action which restores some kind of sense, some rationality in the conduct of sections of a single community. So what we're saying is this, that denial is part of the problem in the Sudan. One doesn't say that acknowledgement is the magic that will do it. No, one says that enlightenment can be and should be made part of the solution.
Okay. Well, at this point, I think we should thank Professor Soyinka for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.